I don't know, to make it less painful when you finally moved out? I won't do that, I said. We're in this for the long haul, right? She searched my face again. It was like she couldn't trust what I was saying and wanted me to reassure her. The long haul? I nodded, then grinned and shrugged. Well, at least until you get tired of me, right? She laughed through her tears, which made her hiccup a couple of times. Who says I'm not already tired of you? Before I could answer, she leaned over and pulled me in and held me until her tears had dried and my shirt was wet for the second time that day. And for the second time that day, also, I felt my body sag with relief. Moreover, I realized I really did feel like a superhero, like Superman. It was like I dodged 2 bullets in one day. And that's the way it played out for the next 3 years. Everything went back to normal. Sandy and I both worked our 60-hour weeks. We spent quiet evenings and relaxed weekends together. And we both moved up in our respective careers. For 3 years, it was all so good again. Until Governor Truelson decided to try his hand at making a run for the White House. That's when I learned for the first time in my life how it felt to be betrayed. And not just by someone I loved, but by almost everyone I loved. The Tennessee governor's mansion is this really pretty red brick number in Nashville. One of the bonuses of being the boss, I guess, is that you can reside in that colossal joint if you want to. The downsides? Well, I'm not sure how I take to all the tourists traipsing through on their little guided tours. Doesn't seem to make much sense to live such a big place if you can't have sex on the stairways whenever you want, right? Anyway, Sandy and I were amongst a group of families staying with her folks at the mansion. The other people there? Well, gathered around the table were her folks and 2 younger brothers and my folks. That's it. And that's how I knew something big was up. Darlene, the busty, frumpy, perpetually frowning middle-aged maid, wheeled in a tray laden with dessert just as Pat stood at the head of the table. "I'd like to thank y'all for coming this weekend," he said, raising his glass of wine. Here, we all echoed, raising our glasses and taking a sip. I waved off the bread pudding for dessert, and Pat smiled at me. "Darlene, dear, why don't you get him a glass of bourbon instead?" I looked at him, and his face was strangely nervous. "And me too, if you don't mind." She nodded and scurried to the kitchen to fetch the bourbon. "I'm not really sure how to say it," he continued, putting the glass down in front of him but remaining on his feet. "Just say it, Pat," Dad said evenly. His sly grin said he knew what was coming. "Yeah, Daddy, say what you've got to say," Patrick Jr. said, bored with the theatrics. "I'm gonna be putting my hat in for the presidency," he said, his eyes scanning our faces for our reactions. I'd like to say I was stunned, but I wasn't. That's what politicians do. They run for higher office and higher office. Once you're governor, the legislature no longer holds any allure. You're no longer the boss, the head honcho, the big cheese getting his butt kissed everywhere by everybody. Therefore, the only higher office for Pat Truelson was the White House. Well, Deborah and I have talked it over, and we've decided that it's now or never. The Republican field's weak right now, and I've got a real shot. Southern politicians dominate at this level, Dad agreed with him. Pat gave a nervous smile. "Let's hope so." He sat, looking around the table before his eyes settled on me. "What?" I said. Not a question, but a statement. "I'm gonna need everyone here to be with me on this, Mark." I nodded. "And you suspect I won't be because—" He fidgeted. "You and my little girl. Everything good there?" I was surprised. I looked at Sandy, who just gave a nervous smile in return, then around the table at the other faces. They all looked at me as if they didn't know the answer. "Why wouldn't it be?" "You two haven't had any babies yet," Deborah finally said. "Not my call. I can assure you I'm doing my part." Pat gave a big grin. "So I can count on y'all tagging along to events, holding hands and smiling and looking the loving young couple?" "Of course." I turned to Sandy. "Right?" She beamed. "Absolutely. What was that all about tonight?" I asked a couple of hours later as I slipped beneath the covers in the guest room allotted to us. "What?" Sandy said, yawning. "That whole how's your marriage doing routine? High stakes, hon. I guess they don't need any bumps in the road before the primaries, or, if he makes it that far, the general election. And why would they think there'd be problems?" She gave a tired shrug. "Not a clue." "You didn't say anything to them?" "Not a word. I told them we were all in." "So you already knew about this?" "They told me when we got here." "And you didn't tell me?" She gave a lazy smile. "Didn't want to spoil the surprise." "They asked you about our marriage?" "Yeah. And you said that we were in it for the long haul." She snuggled in and curled up close to me. I was flat on my back, staring at the ceiling. After a moment, I said. Sandy? Why haven't we had any children yet? She propped her head up in her hand, laying on her side and staring at me. Because we've never discussed it? Is that the only reason? You want kids? I don't know. I mean, we're so busy all the time, I guess. Still, IDV thought we'd have at least talked about it sometime. Why? Isn't that how most marriages go? But we're not most marriages. I turned my head and stared at her. Her expression was unreadable. She seemed confused by my questions, and I couldn't figure out why. You think we could talk about it sometime? Sometime soon? Her eyes narrowed, then a bright smile came over her face. A look of unbridled joy. Sure, she said. When we get out of here, get back to our own place when I get back from this Denver trip. We'll have a nice long discussion and figure it all out. Maybe next Sunday? It's a date. She hugged me, whispering into my ear, I really do love you. Really? I whispered back. She hugged me tighter. Really? An hour later, her professions of love and my entire understanding of what love really is were shattered like a crystal goblet flung at a fireplace. Sandy was no longer cuddled into me. Instead, she was curled into a ball on the far side of the bed, breathing in light, even patterns that told me she was out like a light. Me? I was wide awake. Nothing about the whole evening made any sense. And for not the first time, I was struck by Sandy's curious responses to what should have been simple questions. Giving up on getting to sleep anytime soon, I slid out of bed and pulled on a robe. Maybe another bourbon would help me get to sleep. Walking softly so as not to wake anyone, I crept down the stairs and was surprised to see light sneaking through the almost closed door to the study. Drawing closer, I heard voices. You mean you never told him? Pat Trulson said. Of course not, Mom replied. Why not? Because he was never the hard sell on this. Sandy was. How so? The boy's been in love with her since he was almost out of diapers, Deborah Trulson explained. Sandy, on the other hand, was always a bit of a wild one, and independent as hell. So how'd you get Sandy to go along with it? Dad asked. I felt a deep chill run through my nerve endings, a chill of anger and embarrassment. Deborah gave a low, throaty chuckle. Truth be told, we didn't. I begged her to just go out with him, see if maybe there's something there. She didn't want to, thought it was creepy, what with him being Stevie's little brother and all. But I told her she needed to at least try for her daddy. If everything worked out right, the timing and all, it would all but sweep him into the governor's mansion. And she'd benefit from that. Her career would benefit. Someone snorted, and Pat said, well, it did that all right. She was hesitant for the first week or so, their first couple of dates, Deborah continued. But that Christmas she came home with a grin from ear to ear. I'm thinking she slept with him, and he delivered the goods. That's it, Pat laughed. I'm not sure, but she came into my dressing room that night and said she figured she'd be able to stick with him long enough to get married and maybe for at least a year or so after the marriage. And poor little Mark just played right into her hands, Dad said, amusement in his voice. She's a pretty girl, Mom said. Besides, he's really been in love with her from day one. This was his dream come true. There was silence for a moment, silence during which I felt my hands going numb from the ferocity with which I clenched my fists. After the brief lull, Pat said, so what's kept her with him all these years? You think she's really in love with him now? I mean, she doesn't have any male friends on the side, does she? We don't need that now. Deborah snickered. Not a clue. She seems content. I suppose it's just inertia. They've both been pretty busy with their careers and all, Mom said. Probably not enough time for either of them to really find someone else and go through the whole rigmarole of divorce and all. So you're sure that they'll stay together? I mean? Pat asked. Mark's not going anywhere, Mom said. And Sandy said everything's just fine so far as she's concerned, Deborah said. I heard glasses get laid on tabletops, then Dad said, well, let's hope so, Pat, because you've got a really good shot at this. The slightest bump in the road can upend the whole damned cart. You think? I heard their footsteps as they all moved toward the door. Ducking back, I pressed up against the wall deep in the shadows. It was all I could do to keep from confronting them all as they came into the hallway, but something told me that wouldn't go very well. In my current state of rage and confusion, I'd probably end up beating them all half to death. I was still pressed against the wall 5 minutes later, well after my folks and Sandy's had made their way up the stairs to their respective bedrooms. Now my mind was racing with thoughts. Sandy's curious answers were all explained now. Her reactions to my moods and her facial expressions when professing love and devotion and planning our marriage and on. She'd thought it was all this great big marvelous game, and the notion enraged me. Then another thought struck me. She'd always acted as if I'd known about the game. As if I, too, knew ours was a marriage of political expediency and little else. If she'd known I was in the dark on this, she'd have played her cards closer to her vest. Now, though, the thoughts really came tumbling out, crashing back and forth inside my skull with such force and rapidity that I became dizzy. If it had been a game to her, then did she really have a stable of boyfriends? If she didn't really love me, then why had she been so upset when I'd had the Bonnaroo appeal a few years before? And why had she seemed so relieved when I'd finished and come back to her? I couldn't answer any of the questions. Not a single damned one. If she'd been cheating around on me, she'd been doing it during work hours. Still, except for those few months during the Bonnaroo appeal, our bedroom antics hadn't seemed to suffer more than the biologically necessitated ebb and flow, and the lull during the appeal was as much attributable to my long hours as to hers. Still, it was an arranged marriage. A marriage predicated on political necessity rather than love and devotion. Had it grown to more since then? On my side it had. Then again, I'd loved her from almost the beginning. But had Sandy ever loved me? Had she grown to love me? Or was she just fond of me? Or did she just tolerate me? Or did she resent me and mock me? Without warning, my questions about Sandy were cast aside with the sudden realization that my own parents had sold me out. Without telling me, they played me like a fiddle for their own reasons. Both of them. How the hell do you do that to your own son? I mean, really, how the hell? Sunday had been spent dropping Sandy off at the airport for a 2-day business conference in Denver before driving myself back to Memphis and getting last-minute shopping and laundry done. I turned in early and spent most of the night tossing and turning, wishing the whole time I'd said something to Sandy before seeing her off. Maybe the bed wouldn't have seemed so goddamn transient all of a sudden. Dragging into the office on Monday morning, I looked and felt like death warmed over. Emotionally, I wasn't up to being there. Physically, my energy was just sapped, gone. My problem was that I had no clue what to do. Do I confront Sandy? What would I say? Hey, it's come to my attention this is all just an arranged marriage kind of thing. You sure you don't want out? Then, of course, she'd look at me like I was an idiot. Well done, moron. Worse, she'd then insist we stay together, at least until after the elections down the road. And how do I say no? If I'm happy, do I really care if she's truly and deeply in love with me? Or do I just keep playing along wondering if and when the hammer's going to fall? Sandy seemed happy enough. Hell, we both were happy. Did it matter whether it was love? Did it really matter how it had started out? Arranged marriages happened all the time, both in politics and in third world countries. Hot though she was, you really think Jack Kennedy married Jackie because of a deep, abiding love? Hell no. He married her to get rid of the rumors that he spent his whole life chasing skirts. Then, after they got married, he still spent the rest of his life chasing skirts. But Jack Kennedy had gone into it with eyes wide open. I didn't. Then again, neither had Jackie, and the history books all said she'd been in love with him. Just like I thought I was in love with Sandy. Now, though, I was wondering if I still loved her. Mr. Roberts? I looked from the wall and my eyes focused in on my secretary, Thelma Sanderson. Her arms were holding a tall pile of thick, heavy binders. Yes, Miss Sanderson. You mind if I find room for these here? I waved around the office. Sure. What are they? All the books for your daddy's campaign committee. Mr. Parker's got no room left and told me to find someplace to park him for now. Being as he's your daddy, I figured this was as good a place as any. How long? She shrugged as she bent over and stacked them against the wall next to boxes of appellate records I was in the middle of plowing through. Couple of days, I suppose. Whatever, I said, turning back and facing the walls. I'm not sure why I did it. I stared at the walls for another 10 or 15 minutes or so. Those books, though, they just kind of called to me, beckoned me over to have a peek. Jim Parker's people, along with a troop of weary-looking accountants in rumpled suits, were always poring over those books. I'd seen them all gathered around the massive mahogany table in the main conference room every few weeks, arguing back and forth and jotting figures and notes. I'd always thought myself well rid of being called in on that crap, but my mind was tired of worry and I decided to sneak a peek at the books. Hauling 2 of them over to my tiny round work table, I flipped over the book containing the most recent entries for the first quarter. It was filled with copies of Federal Election Commission filings and disclosures and all manner of esoterica required to be reported for others to pore over and look for irregularities. In short, it was Greek to me. Pushing aside book 1 and flipping over book 2, I saw something completely different. These were a series of memoranda on different campaign finance issues. This was more like it, I thought. Boring trivialities that make up the sum and substance of the law. How to categorize this donation and that expenditure, how to say what you had to say without really saying anything at all. This was major stuff, I thought. Campaigns try to be as discreet as possible. No sense in letting some expenditure sloppily labeled come back to bite you in the butt when some a-hole from the New York Times does his homework on a slow news day. Almost an hour later, my problems and the piles of real work on my desk forgotten, I came across a curiously titled memorandum, Staff Support or Consultant. It was brief, just short of 3 pages. It was the first 3 paragraphs, though, that burst from the page and knocked the wind from my lungs. Question presented. How best to label expenditures of child support so as to facially comply with FEC regulations, but avoid revealing the true nature of the payments. Reading on, I discovered that child support payments were being made on a regular basis to one Clarice Talbot. They'd been paying them for 7 or 8 years, but the regulations had changed on how to label campaign staff payments. The Finance Committee wanted to continue making the payments from its coffers, but it didn't want to raise any red flags on how it was labeled under the new guidelines. Going back to my desk, I typed in the Google search for Clarice Talbot. There were dozens, but one name popped out from an old Washington Post article. My father, in a picture at his desk, with a very young, very pretty Clarice Talbot, his secretary, leaning over his shoulder as he signed something in his Senate office. I clicked into my father's Senate website. Nothing on a Clarice Talbot. I went back to the ledgers. 20 minutes of frantic skimming later, I found an address. The checks were being mailed to some town in Illinois. Grant City. I'd heard of it. Someplace an hour or so outside of Chicago. Back on Google, I confirmed through a white pages search that Clarice Talbot still lived at the Grant City address. There was nothing more. Not in the ledgers, and not on my internet searches. Then I sat back and rubbed my temples, trying to ward off the crashing that was building in my brain. Dad's campaign was paying child support to Dad's former secretary. A pretty secretary, at that. There was only one explanation. I had a brother I'd never known existed, and he was in Grant City, Illinois. Gradually, the throbbing in my head subsided and a peace settled over me. A peace brought on as my plan gradually coalesced and took shape. With a smile, I leaned forward and typed. Once done, I printed the document, then picked up the phone to call Human Resources. Yeah, Marcia, I said. Mark Roberts here. Just checking to make sure you're in. What can I do for you, Mark? She said. Just need to drop off my letter of resignation, I said, and hung up before she could say more. I was out of there before any of the partners returned from lunch. And that's how I ended up on that balcony 8 hours later. Back where this whole story started. My car had been sold, checking account closed, clothes packed into a single suitcase, and Amtrak ticket bought. I watched the sun swallow up that shrinking golden band, gave one last look at the mighty Mississippi trudging away 4 floors below, then picked up my guitar and suitcase, turned, and left. I was off to find my brother and have a nice long talk with Clarice Talbot. I was taking the city of New Orleans to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere away from the cold betrayals of those who'd supposedly loved me. I was so down, I couldn't even hum the damn tune as I sat on that train. When I got off the Amtrak train in Chicago, I made a beeline out the doors of Union Station and down the street to the Atrium building. There was a train to Grant City leaving in 20 minutes, and I damn sure wanted to be on it. An hour and a half later, my body swaying to the rhythm of the train, I looked out the windows and took in the passing scenery. I hadn't been back to Chicago since graduating law school, and I now regretted not taking in at least lunch in the city. I could have dropped by my old haunts, maybe stopped in to see one of my old professors, looked up an old classmate, anything to ground me again. Ground me in the feeling that I still had a past and people in that past that really gave a shit about me. Grant City next stop, the tinny voice said over the intercom. All exit Grant City. Last stop, Grant City. Jesus, we get it already, I thought, looking at the other 4 people scattered throughout the car. People I'd never seen and would probably never see again. And that's when the thought struck me. I couldn't go back to Chicago and see the people I'd known. This was the White House we were talking about. And Dad's Senate career, too. They'd be looking for me, trying to find out where I'd gone off to and what I was doing. They'd want to talk me into coming back and just playing it all out sweet and easy as pie. I smiled, picturing them all squirming. I was surprised no one had dropped by my place yesterday afternoon. I know there had been calls, but I'd let them all go to voicemail. Now, though, they know I was gone. If not now, then as soon as Sandy came home and saw my clothes and my favorite guitar gone, they'd be scrambling, that's for damn sure. And the whole image satisfied me as I hadn't been satisfied since before Pat Truelson had given his little dinner time speech. Since before they'd all unknowingly spilled the beans with their little late-night brandies and bourbons. Let's cut the bullshit on the next couple of days. The major parts are pretty simple. I got into Grant City, found out it was too small for cabs, but not too big that I couldn't lug my stuff to a hotel a mile and a half out on the edge of town. Walked next door for a quick lunch, then next door to that to use the cash from my accounts and the sale of my Lexus to buy a decent used car. Then went off in search of a realtor and an apartment to rent. The morning of day 2 was spent moving a suitcase and a guitar into a furnished one-bedroom apartment, getting a new driver's license, and driving around looking for a job. 10:45, I pulled into the parking lot of a tavern on the edge of town. Help wanted bartender, the sign read. I hadn't tended bar since law school, but how the hell hard could it be? A gin and tonic's a gin and tonic, and judging by the looks of the place, that would be an upscale drink for this neck of the woods. It took a moment after walking in for my eyes to adjust to the dark barroom. Help you, a voice to my right said, and I turned. A big dude, late 30s, early 40s, maybe 6'4" and at least 300 pounds, was mopping the floor inside the horseshoe-shaped bar. You still hirin'? I asked. He motioned me to a bar stool, then leaned against the mop and said, Name's Ferlin Fargo. I hesitated, unsure whether to give my real name. Mark Roberts. Really? Ferlin said. His eyes flickered to my wrist, to the gold Rolex my parents had bought for a law school graduation present. You sure about that? I nodded. Last time I checked. And you know how to tend bar, Mark Roberts? The tone of his voice made clear he didn't believe either part of that one, that I could tend bar or that I'd given my real name. I smiled. Last time I checked. Ever do it before? Tend bar? Some. What do you mean, some? I did it for a while in college. You know how to make a Rob Roy? A Manhattan? Old-fashioned? Margarita? Daiquiri? I nodded. Then make me one, Ferlin challenged. Which one? Old-fashioned. I stood, made my way to the back bar, looked around at the setup, nodded, and reached for a highball glass. Just tell me what goes in it, he said. No sense wasting perfectly good booze. Muddle some sugar with bitters, stir in a shot of bourbon, fill with ice, top with soda. Garnish? Cherry and orange slice if you've got him. He gave a grudging smile. We've got him, all right. In the cooler still? I asked, nodding toward the small refrigerator beneath the cash register. Yep. Except we use bar sugar. No problem. His eyes narrowed. Where you from, Mark Roberts? South. Where exactly? I didn't say anything, just looked at him. You running from the law? Ex-wife. Not yet. He looked at me for a moment, trying to gauge my truthfulness. Then he shrugged, apparently satisfied or no longer giving a damn, and reached his hand out. $10 an hour. 10:30 to 6, Monday through Friday. Maybe some weekend hours if you want M, or if someone calls in sick or something. Think you can handle that? Policy on tips? Your tips are your own. You work with someone. You split the tips while you're working together. You may want to tip out the waitresses if they help you out or something. Or maybe the busboy if he gets you beer or ice. Your decision. How you handle it decides how much they help, I suppose. Fair enough. Prices? There's a list next to the register. If there's a drink special, and there usually ain't unless it's a Friday or Saturday with a band or something, they don't change. I shrugged. Seems easy enough. He snorted. We'll see. So am I hired? S'pose so. When you want me to start? Is now too soon? I'm dressed okay, I asked, looking down at my jeans, loafers with no socks, and long-sleeved white dress shirt with cuffs rolled to mid-forearm. Overdressed if anything. Need time to go change or something? This works for me if it works for you. Works for me. I extended my arm. He took my hand in his great big beefy paw on the end of his arm and held me. Don't steal from me, Mark Roberts. I'll know. Okay? Not gonna happen. Don't let it. He gave my hand a squeeze while eyeing me closely, then let go and gave the barest hint of a smile. Welcome to the hitching rail. Glad to be here. He tipped the mop to me. See if you can get this area all clean before they start showing up in 10 minutes, huh? I took the mop and went to work. Thank you, Jesus, I heard Ferlin say to himself as he disappeared to the other side of the building, presumably the kitchen. I waited all of no time before the first customers started rolling in. 7 of them before some tall, gangly chick with frizzy bleach blonde hair ran in all frantic at 15 past 11. Sorry I'm late, she said, handing me her purse before reaching over the bar and snatching up a black apron and ticket pad. We seem to have it covered, I said, placing the rest of the drinks on a tray. "I'll take this," she said, her eyes going from the drinks to the dining room and back again. "2 cherries in this one," she said, pointing to a glass of Coke. "Levon always wants 2 cherries." I skewered 2 cherries and laid them across the top. "I'll take it from here," she said with a bright smile, hefting the tray to her shoulder. "Go for it." 2.5 hours later, I was washing up the rest of the dirty glasses from the lunch crowd when the frizzy-haired chick plopped down with a huge sigh. "Wednesdays can get pretty nutso, you know?" "Not really." Her head twitched and her eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Mark." "When did you start?" "This morning." She gave a bright, bouncy smile and thrust her arm straight across the bar. "Well, Mark, nice to meet ya." I shook her hand and said, "And you are?" She rolled her eyes like it was the dumbest question she'd heard in ages. "Debbie." "Debbie who's always late and still hasn't cleaned up the rest of her tables," Ferland said as he waddled toward the bar. "That's the one," she agreed, then hopped up and turned to Ferland. "Geez, just trying to be friendly and all. Be friendly when you've got your tables clean." Ferland Fargo sat at the bar looking like a man who just played a football game. His thick black hair was damp and all akimbo, his face dripping sweat, his shoulders sagging beneath his sweat-soaked shirt. "Water," he croaked. I got a tall glass, filled it with water, and placed it in front of him. He drank it in one long pull, put the glass down, and nodded for me to do it again. I did, and he chugged this one down in one fell swoop, also. "Thanks," he said, his breath now returning to normal and the spring returning to his limbs. "Wednesdays can be a real bitch." "How so?" "Stupid Italian day. Spaghetti and meatballs, ravioli, sausage and peppers. The kitchen's full of pots of boiling water. Like a goddamn steam bath back there. Sure seems to pack him in, though. Must be good." He looked at me, and I saw the glint of a smile playing over his stubbly face. "Course it's good. More important, it's pretty cheap. That's why it's such a pain in the ass." "So every day isn't this busy?" He gave a chortle. "Oh, they're all pretty much like this. Right down to Debbie always being between 10 and 20 minutes late for work. Always. I suppose sometimes she's later, but not by much." "Never early?" "Never." I looked at the waitress in the other room, stacking dishes on her arms and humming to herself. "Crowd loves her. They don't love you. She can get away with it. You can't. Understand?" "Yet," I said, trying to hide my smile. "Yet? What do you mean, yet?" "The crowd don't love me yet, but they will." He looked at me, then threw his arms up. "Great, another prima donna, just great." I stifled my laugh and went back to cleaning. This sure beat researching and writing appellate briefs. After work, I drove slowly past 714 Madison Street. It was a tiny little bungalow, no more than 35 feet wide, painted white with yellow shutters and a green shingled roof. It was neat, though, and the yard was kept up and trimmed. Behind the gauzy white curtains in the front picture window, I saw the shadow of a person moving toward the back of the house. Kitchen, probably. Pulling over to the curb, I parked and shut off the car. Now what? I'd found where Clarice Talbot lived with her son, with my brother, but I didn't know how to proceed from here. My plans had been to leave and find them. Well, guess what? I'd left and now I'd found them. But I couldn't just go up and knock on the door, could I? As I pondered it, a car drove past me and swung into her driveway. Almost before it was fully stopped, the rear passenger door opened and a little kid in an impossibly bulky football uniform got out. Reaching back in, he pulled out a football helmet, gave a wave, backed away, and slammed the car door. The front door opened, spilling warm light across the front lawn of autumn. A woman stood in the doorway, a tired smile on her pale face. The little boy ran to her, gave her a hug, and pushed past her and into the house. Without another look, she closed the door and followed him inside. So that was her. That was Clarice Talbot, looking much as she'd looked in the 8-year-old picture with my father, except now she seemed more tired and worn and sad. Even her smile for the little boy was tired, though it seemed to exude genuine warmth. What the hell had Dad done? How could he just so callously do this? I felt my anger building again, and I slammed the steering wheel in frustration at my years of ignorance. Goddamn them all to hell. Right straight to hell. About 2 weeks later, I walked into the hitching rail to be met by the burly figure of my boss, the ever-grumpy and grousing Ferland Fargo. "Take your shirt off and come with me." "Take my shirt off? You keep wearing those damned white dress shirts. Don't know how you haven't ruined them all by now, but you'll sure as shit ruin one now." "Doing what?" helping me move some chairs and tables up from the basement. Something special? Lincoln County Women's Bar Association meeting. They meet once a month, bouncing from place to place. They're here 3 times a year. Today's our turn again. I smiled. I've got to wait on a bunch of women lawyers? You won't be smiling in a couple of hours. Demanding as hell and lousy tippers. I shrugged, unbuttoning my shirts. Halfway through lugging up extra tables and chairs, Ferlin grunted. So why do you always wear the same thing? All I got. You ain't got no other shirts? Not appropriate for working in, I don't. You ever thinking of just maybe buying some? Something cheap at Walmart or something? Nope. Weirdo. Whatever. Ferlin was like that. Too young to be a father figure, too old to be like an older brother. Still, he treated pretty much everyone the same. Grousing, bitching, complaining, and then a shy smile and a quiet thanks or simple pat on the back. Debbie seemed to worship him, though he easily weighed $180 more than her and had 15 years on her. She just glowed whenever he was around. All the employees seemed used to him and comfortable with his gentle pokes at everyone. So anybody find you yet? He asked, leaning against a table and catching his breath now that we were done. What do you mean? This soon-to-be ex-wife you seem to be running from. No one knows where I am. He nodded, his face troubled. What? I prompted. None of my business, he said, shaking his head. Fine, I said, smiling. So it's none of your business. So what? What were you gonna say? Must be hard, is all. Just leaving and now you're surrounded by total strangers. Don't know anyone. No family. I smiled, grabbing a dry bar rag and wiping the perspiration off my chest and from under my arms. My brother's dead. Killed in a car accident a while back. And my mom and dad, well, let's just say they were in cahoots with the soon-to-be ex, okay? Taking her side? A little more complicated than that. He nodded, then left it alone as I pulled on my shirt. I helped Debbie serve the women of the bar association, then spent an hour and a half fetching drinks and refilling water glasses. Most of them ignored me and treated me like a cockroach beneath their feet. 4 of them, though, gave me the smile, light brush, and eyelash batting that indicated they may be available. One was about 50, full-figured in a too-tight sweater and too short skirt for both her age and her figure, but she seemed carnivorous whenever I was nearby. I was afraid she'd trip me and beat me to the floor. Toward the end of the row of tables sat a platinum blonde, maybe in her late 20s, who kept gazing at me and, once I made eye contact, kept giving a gentle tilt of the head to indicate she was curious. When she got up to go to the restroom, though, I noticed she was tall and skinny verging on anorexic. Also, the foam domes and flat hips didn't help things much. I suppose she was pretty if you're turned on by lanky models who look like a pipe cleaner with big tits. The other 2 sat next to each other. One of them was short and slim, early to mid-30s, with a pale complexion and tired eyes. Her hair seemed limp, too, which matched the rest of her posture. She reminded me of Ally McBeal, sort of wan and weary in a business suit. She didn't really give the flirtatious smile or the light arm brush so much as she kept looking at me, then turning away with embarrassment when our eyes met. Her smile seemed forced, and she seemed just all broken and insecure. To her left, though, was the hottest one of the group. My eyes had latched onto her the moment she'd walked in, unable to look away until she was seated and my duties suddenly thrust upon me. She had it all: pale olive complexion on smooth, flawless skin, lustrous mane of thick, black hair framing the face of a Latina goddess, a beautiful body with high, perky breasts complemented by a round, perfectly squeezable booty and long, slim legs. She was like Pocahontas in those old paintings from grade school. Classic dark beauty, tall and proud and stacked perfectly. She was dressed neither sexily nor conservatively, her eyes and smiles not promising untold delights so much as appraising and considering the possibilities. Her dark eyes were direct and unflinching. She was the bowl of porridge that was just right, and I spent half of lunch imagining how that bowl would taste. All too soon, they were all gone. And Ferlin was right. They were lousy tippers. The 50-year-old left me her phone number, though. My back was to the bar at 5:20 that afternoon, reaching into the cooler for 3 Budweisers and a Leinenkugel. When you have a moment, I heard a voice say to my right. Turning, I was surprised to see the 2 women from the bar association. No, not the pipe cleaner and the cougar. Pocahontas was the one who had spoken, and Ally McBeal was sitting beside her trying to slink down and hide on her bar stool. Just a sec, ladies, I said. I delivered the beers in my hands, then came back. Gin and tonic, Pocahontas said. Lime. I nodded, then turned to her companion. And you? She looked to Pocahontas, then back to me. The same, please. I turned to make their drinks, delivered them, got the money and gave the change, and went about my business, all without another word. Mark, Ferlin called a few minutes later from the corner of the bar. I walked over and leaned against the inside of the bar, my eyes sweeping the bar top for empty drinks as Ferlin talked in that low, gravelly rumble of his. Think you can pull a double tomorrow? He asked. Terry's kids got a game. I shrugged. Sure. It's a Friday, and there are busiest days around here. The fish fry keeps us scrambling from lunch until closing time. I'm in. I stood to move back to the center of the bar to better keep an eye on things when Ferlin locked his hand around my forearm. Don't look now, he said, his voice getting lower. But I think those two over there are giving you the serious once-over. You think? Doesn't hurt business none to maybe sidle over and say hey once in a while. Know what I mean? I tensed, then gave a curt nod. The slight smile left my face. I'm not saying you need to be a gigolo or something, Ferlin said, backpedaling. I'm just saying that being friendly don't hurt things, you know? I tried to force the smile back and whispered, don't worry, I'll do my best. Spotting an empty beer bottle hit the bar across the way, I muttered, excuse me, and escaped. Ladies, I said a few moments later, standing in front of them and giving a brief smile before again sweeping the bar with his eyes. We set for drinks, okay? We're fine on drinks, the taller one said, managing to make that simple response suggestive with the way she emphasized drinks. We're actually wondering about you. I looked at them and gave a smile. The tall one raised an eyebrow, but the smaller one seemed to shrivel in embarrassment. And what, may I ask, were you wondering about me? You hear that, Whitney? A Southern gentleman. She faced me and said, I just love a nice soft Southern drawl. We were wondering what your name is, Whitney said. Mark, I said, wiping my hands on the bar towel before reaching across and offering my hand. Mark Roberts. She shook my hand. Her hand was damp and the shake timid and too quick. And I'm Rebecca, the other one said. Her handshake was, as I suspected it would be, firm and held for enough time to convey intimacy. Well, Whitney, Rebecca, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thanks, Whitney said, her voice barely audible. The pleasure's ours, Rebecca said. Where are you from, Mark? South of here. We know that, she continued. But where south of here? Way south of here. And when did you move to Grant City? Couple weeks back. Where do you live? In an apartment. Are you going to play this game all night? What game? She gave me a long look, as if she were trying to make up her mind about something. She clearly wasn't used to men who didn't fawn all over her, but she didn't seem to fall back from the challenge, either. Her face softened into a grin of her own. Fair enough, Rebecca said. I'm sorry for prying. We're just wondering if you're available. He's married, Whitney said, her eyes on my left hand where the dent from the ring was still visible. For some reason, I was unable to look away from the pale woman. The look on her face said she expected it, disappointment and relief at the same time, but also sadness and a touch of bluing at the gills, like she was nauseous almost. That true? You married, Mark? I held up the ring finger in response. It's a dent, not a ring. Divorced then? Something like that. Done with it? Or still going through it? I shrugged. Whitney surprised me when she said, sucks, don't it? I turned to her and looked hard. I would say, more than you can possibly imagine. But I'm suspecting I'd be wrong about that, right? If possible, she paled further, then gave a barely perceptible nod. Rebecca reached her arm around Whitney's shoulders and gave a brief squeeze on her upper arm. Buck up, kiddo. There's lots more life to live. She gave a weak smile in response and mumbled, sorry. I tilted my head. For what? Being in the same sinking boat I'm in? My boat sank a little over a year ago. And you're still down? She's just having problems getting back on her feet again, Rebecca explained. The few guys she's seen since have pretty much been pigs. You a pig, Mark? I gave a broad grin at both of them and laid on the accent a bit thick. Of course not. I'm a Southern gentleman, remember? Exactly, Rebecca said, smiling back at me. Whitney managed to get some color back and give a bit of a smile. Excuse me, ladies, I said, spotting some empty beer bottles hitting the bar and moving off to take care of business. When I turned back, they were leaving. See you around, Rebecca said with a little wave. I gave a wave back and watched them go, and tried to hide the first real hard-on I'd had in weeks. They were both intriguing in different ways, and images of a threesome filled my suddenly adolescent mind. Can't blame a guy for fantasizing, can you? The rest of the night was spent like most of the 14 before it. park down the street from Clarice Talbot's home, watch my little brother get dropped off and charge inside, go home and make a soup and sandwich, and play guitar while watching television. I still couldn't figure out how to proceed. By now, there was no doubt that little Skylar Talbot was my brother. He looked exactly as I'd looked, and presumably my father had looked at that age. Yet, just approaching Clarice and injecting myself into her life, and my little brother's life, seemed too jolting. On the other hand, I needed to get off dead center. In the meantime, I was satisfied to just watch the little mini-me in the uniform that weighed nearly as much as he did. Then my thoughts turned, as they usually did just before I got ready for bed, to Sandy. My folks and hers were banished to a dark place. I kept suppressed lest my mood turn sour. I still had mixed feelings about Sandy, though. Once the whole shock of everything had worn away, I was able to analyze our history more clinically. For example, her mood and absence for those 3 months, I was busy righting the wrongs inflicted upon Napoleon Bonaparte Bonnaroo. I now suspected, and was pretty much outright convinced that she'd had an affair. The problem? I wasn't really sure how I felt about that. If she'd viewed the entire marriage as a scam she was convinced I was about ready to put an end to at the time, then how culpable was she? I mean, we weren't really married, were we? This one kept me going back and forth. I mean, hell, she'd apparently not hesitated even a second to end the probable affair once she'd seen the news reports carrying the coverage of Nap's newfound freedom. She'd immediately come back to me with sorrow and contrition written all over her face. And from there, our marriage had been fun and, I thought, loving and, at the very least, mutually satisfying. I'd also spent hours upon hours replaying our marriage in my mind and couldn't come up with any clues that she'd had a passel of boyfriends on the side. To the contrary, our love life, her moods, our work hours, all of it was pretty even keel and steady the whole time we'd been together. If anything, it was better than ever after those 3 months of misery during the big appeal. The final thing with which I endlessly wrestled was whether Sandy was aware of my ignorance. Looking back on it all the way to day one, I could recall hundreds of comments and expressions that, in hindsight, indicated she assumed I was fully aware of our parents' arrangement for us. Then again, she'd never really come out and said it. She'd never said, you know, I'm glad our parents talked us into getting married to help Daddy's campaign along, and I'm glad we gave it a go for more than a couple of years. Thus the conundrum. Were her comments an assumption that I was in it with eyes wide open, or were her comments sly digs at my ignorance and the whole situation in which she found herself? For the umpteenth night in a row, I crawled under the sheets and stared at the ceiling wondering about the answers. The following Thursday saw me surprised twice. First, Rebecca dropped by for a drink after work sans Whitney. Gin and tonic with lime? I said as she sat. Very good, she said, her smile a dazzling row of straight, bright teeth that almost buckled my knees. Once the drink was in front of her and paid for, she said, So, Mark, you got a last name? Roberts. Her eyes narrowed. I've heard that name somewhere before. You famous? I swept my arms around the horseshoe-shaped bar, Monday through Friday from 11 till 6. Her expression remained thoughtful, her lips pursed in concentration. Excuse me, I said after a moment, rushing off to get some beers for a gang of construction workers flooding through the door. When I was done with that, I heard Ferland swearing into the phone behind me. Turning, I saw him slam down the phone. Problem? Stupid band, he said. Golden Rodeo was supposed to play here tomorrow night, 9 to 1, but their singer and bass player were in an accident last night. Banged up pretty good. They've got to cancel. I frowned. Not good. His blood pressure, never very low in the first place, seemed dangerously high and set to pop through the top of his head like a geyser. Management company says the rest of their acts are fully booked, so no replacements. I nodded, gave it less thought than I should have, and said, I can play if you want. His eyes went narrow, then wide. Then he laughed. Yeah, right. You. That hurt more than a touch. I'm not kidding. Play what? Guitar. And sing too. Ever done it before? Yeah. I was in a band all through college and law school. You still in a band? He said, his eyes again narrowing and his face getting serious as he thought it over. Nope. Any chance of getting them back together on a day's notice? I shook my head, then said, but I don't need to. I can just play guitar and sing along. What kind of music? Whatever you want to hear. None of that rap shit, right? Or heavy metal. Little tough to do with one guy and a guitar. He nodded, crossing his arms and scratching the stubble on his chin with his stumpy, thick as a sausage forefinger. Equipment. I've got an acoustic. No amps, no mic, No electric guitar, no mixing board. And the acoustic plugs in? You can run it through speakers? I nodded. Built in. And you say you can do this? I smiled. What VE you got to lose? That settled it. Let me make some calls. For what? I think I can get you some equipment. All of it. If an electric's coming along for the ride, I prefer a Telecaster, I said. You'll take what I can scrounge up, he said, turning his back to me and picking up the phone. Turning around, a broad grin spread across my face. I saw Whitney sliding into the bar stool next to Rebecca. Her eyes were on Rebecca's cell phone, and Rebecca was saying something to her. Then they both looked at me, Whitney's eyes wide. Screw technology, I thought, picking up a glass to make another gin and tonic. And you're an attorney, Mark Roberts, Rebecca said. Apparently a pretty goddamn good one. And you were married to the governor's daughter. And a senator's son, Whitney shot in, continuing the broadside. So what's a senator's son married to the governor's daughter doing here tending bar instead of practicing law in Tennessee? Rebecca said, then sat back to await my answer. My lips tightened. Well? Whitney prodded when it became clear I wasn't going to answer. I looked from one to the other, unsure whether to answer. Long story, I muttered. Rebecca raised her eyebrows, and Whitney said, your marriage fell apart and you ran away up here? Something like that. They know where you are? I hesitated, then shook my head. That's a pretty prickish thing to do, don't you think? Not just the words, but the tone in her voice as well. Snippy and catty and judgmental. I saw red. Me? Prickish? After all the shit my family and wife had put me through? I don't know, I said through gritted teeth. Want to tell me all about your divorce and how you were perfect and it was all his fault? I almost regretted it before the words were out of my mouth. Whitney looked like I'd punched her in the solar plexus. Her mouth hung open, her skin blanched, and she seemed on the verge of tears. Rebecca, too, was stunned. Her eyes shooting from Whitney to me, then back to Whitney again. Jesus, she said, putting her arm around the object of my venom. Settle down. Both of you. Rebecca recovered enough to shoot me a look that could have vaporized me on the spot. Fortunately, I wasn't backing down. Instead, I was struggling to control my anger. After only a few seconds, I turned my back on them and went to the other side of the bar, making busy cleaning dirty glasses in the washing sinks. A few minutes later, I saw the door swing open and watched them both leave. This time there was no boner. Instead, my measured breathing was an effort to keep from throwing something and killing some poor schmuck on the other side of the bar. Given that the other side of the bar was mostly construction workers, I figured I'd only survive the first thrown bottle by about 20 seconds. After a few minutes, someone called hey, and I turned to see who needed a drink. For heaven's sake, Mark, one of the workers said with a lopsided grin. What the hell you have to go and do that for? They were the only good-looking tail in the whole joint. I tried to grin and shrug, failed and managed only to look like a brain-dead spastic, and walked around the bar to refresh drinks. When I got to the half-finished drinks left by Rebecca and Whitney, I almost swept up the napkin without seeing what she'd written there. You're right. I'm sorry. Now I really felt like an a-hole, something the construction workers didn't let me forget as I finished my shift and left for home. Late the next afternoon, I was still in a funk waiting for my shift to end so I could go home and crawl into a hole somewhere. I was snapped out of my thoughts at 2:30 when Ferlin rapped his knuckles on the bar. Yeah, come on, he said. Debbie'll watch the bar while we're gone. Where are we going? Pick up that equipment you need. Ah shit, my brain said to the rest of my body. I'd totally forgotten. You coming? He prodded when I stood there like an idiot. I tossed the bar rag on the counter and followed him. 10 minutes later, we turned onto a long gravel driveway and made our way toward a house that was neither new nor old, huge nor small. It was just nice. Off to the right was a field of mowed lawn with a few ancient oaks rustling their dying leaves in the breeze. At the end was a simple pole barn. As we pulled up around the back of the house, the back door opened and a man walked out and toward us. A man I thought I'd seen before. He was walking toward us with a wide smile and stuck his arm out at Ferlin 10 paces before reaching him. Hey Ferlin. Co-op. They shook hands. Then the other fellow threw his arms around Ferlin's massive frame and gave him a tight hug. Once they broke, he turned to me and smiled. Hey, I'm Teddy Cooper. I smiled and nodded. Of course, Teddy Cooper. Singer and guitarist for General Beauregard. Mark Roberts, I said, shaking his hand. Come on, he said, walking off toward the pole barn and calling back to Ferlin. Why don't you back the Jeep up to the shed? I followed him while Ferlin got back in the vehicle. Pretty much got your pick, he said when we entered. Flipping a switch, The big room was illuminated by harsh lighting that revealed a traveling band's full instrumental equipment register. Drums, bass guitars, keyboards and 2 pianos, acoustic and electric guitars, effects pedals, soundboards, mics, cables, wires, every goddamn thing except the light show. We practice here a lot before touring. We're not putting you out or anything? He smiled. Not a bit. Just got back about a month ago. We're all taking a break while Nick and Will and I work out some new songs and new arrangements. I nodded. You got any idea what I need? Sure. I've played there before. Come on, give me a hand. Teddy, Ferlin, and I loaded up a few amps, some patch cords, a small mixing board, and a mic with telescoping stand. Which guitar you want? He said as we caught our breath. Whatever you got. Preference? Telecaster. He nodded his head toward the row of guitars to the side. Pick one. I looked. There were 3 Fender Telecasters amidst some Les Pauls, Stratocasters, a Paul Reed Smith, a Gretsch, and 2 Rickenbackers. These all yours, I said, envying the hell out of him. Some are Nick's. Does it matter? What he don't know won't hurt him. I looked at him. Still, if it's all the same to you. He gave a chuckle. Fine, take this one. He grabbed a white Telecaster from the row and walked over to a row of hardshell cases. He flipped the catches on one labeled Nick, laid the guitar in, and closed it up. I'd really rather not. Really? Teddy interrupted. He won't give a shit. And that's the best one of the lot. Tons of special specs built in at his request, and easily the most playable. You're gonna do a one-man show. Might as well have something with some teeth, right? I hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Thanks. So you gonna be there tonight? Ferlin asked as I loaded the guitar into the Jeep. Probably about 8:30. Gives me plenty of time to set him up. You don't have to. His look strangled the words in my throat. He was about the 10th person in the past 24 hours to look at me like I was daft. You'll never get it right in that goddamned barn. I've played there before. I'll have you set up in no time. Fair enough. He smiled and stuck out his arm. Good. I'll see you then. Thanks. Don't mention it. Ferlin chuckled to himself half the drive back to work. What's so funny? I finally said. You. Jesus, Mark. I know you recognized him, but you didn't even react. Like it was no big deal. I've met famous people before, I explained. Yeah? That famous? Like who? Oh, I don't know, I thought. People like the president and all manner of legislators and governors and entertainment bigwigs and shit like that. Hell, I got to play a guitar duet with Alan Jackson once, and he's pretty big, I wanted to say. But I didn't. Just famous people, I finally said. But after all that time, the whole time acting like it's no big deal, you get all flustered when he offers to come help you get it all set up. Just didn't expect it is all, I said. I mean, I'm sure he's got better things to do, right? Nah, Ferlin replied. Jenny and the kids are out of town. He's probably bored stiff about now. I was silent for much of the rest of the ride back. As we pulled into the parking lot, though, I said, how do you know him? Teddy? Everyone around here knows him. Most of the band, actually, but especially Teddy and Nick. I graduated a year ahead of them both. We all go way back. And they both still live here? Teddy never left. Nick moved back around the time Leadfoot broke up and General Beauregard got formed. Wow. He put the Jeep in park, shut it off, and turned to me. You keep your eyes open, and you'll see more than just them. What do you mean? We're not that far from Chicago, he explained. Far enough to be in the country, not so far that it's a major pain in the butt to get into the city. So, there's a lot of pretty famous and powerful folks that live out this way. Like? He rattled off the names of a movie director, 2 writers, some coaches and players for the Bears, Cubs, and White Sox, and a few others. They all live around here, all within 10 miles. Where? He smiled. You drive down a country road and see a long driveway disappearing into trees. Chances are one of them's occupied by one of them folks. Wow, I thought. This was almost like living in Nashville again. No wonder no one took it all too seriously. Still, I had to admit that Teddy Cooper was about as down-to-earth as you can get. And I was more than a bit nervous about him critiquing my playing and singing. Teddy was as good as his word. 20 minutes after he showed, the equipment was all hot and the amps all in balance. He ran me through the effects pedals taped to the floor next to the microphone stand, then gave a nod, wished me luck, and waded into the growing crowd to get a beer. Almost everyone clapped him on the back as he passed, and he stopped to chat with more than a few of them. I heard a thunk on the tiny stage to my right and Ferlin said, "Move over, son." I did. He reached under the mic, flipped the switch, and tapped to make sure it was live. Okay, he said to the crowd in his gravelly voice. Here's the deal. Couple of the fellas in Golden Rodeo went out and hurt themselves, so they can't play here tonight. Mark here said he could take their place. There were some jeers and whistles, and I couldn't tell if it was derision or good-natured teasing. Probably a mixture of both. A few faces were genuinely upset when they heard Golden Rodeo wasn't going to be playing. You just hold tight, Lou, Ferlin called out to a heavy-set man with a crew cut leading his wife toward the door. The man stopped. Give him at least 2 or 3 songs before you decide that my original instincts were correct on old Mark's talents, huh? The man nodded and cried out, I'll give him 2. Fair enough. So if you'd all please put your hands together for a man making his debut in our fine little establishment. The tepid clapping was better than I expected. Ferlin stepped back from the mic and leaned over and whispered in my ear. I want you to drop these suckers. Got it? Dropping. Then he gave me a big grin and a sharp smack on the back. I grinned in response, watched him step off the stage and disappear into the crowd, then looked over the 60 or so expectant faces waiting for me to try and fail. Instead, I smiled and slowly started playing the intro to what I figured would be a decent opening number. 20 seconds later, I stepped to the mic and hit the key perfectly with the opening lyrics. Well, I left Oklahoma driving in my Pontiac, just about to lose my mind. I was going to Arizona, maybe on to California where the people all live so fine. The crowd hesitated at first, then I saw some foot stomping, and by the time I hit the instrumental break after the first chorus of Tulsa Time, they were cheering and whistling. Even Lou what's-his-name moseyed up to the bar and got him and little Mrs. Lou a couple more beers. That's when I knew they wouldn't ride me out of there on a rail. I took my only break at 10 to 11, and the place was wall-to-wall. Need a beer? Ferlin shouted above the din to my right. I shook my head. No thanks. Just water. He smiled, gave me a thumbs up, and pushed his way through the crowd toward the bar. The crowd pretty much parted for me as I made my way toward the front door to get some fresh air. There was the occasional pat on the back, head nod, nice job, and such, but mostly they were talking and drinking and waiting for the break to end so they could get back onto the dance floor. You're a man of many talents. I heard someone almost shout into my ear as a hand fell on my shoulder. It was the short, washed-out one, Whitney. I gave a tired smile. Thanks. Going outside? I nodded. Mind if I tag along? Sure. She pushed through the crowd lining the bar and put her drink on the bar top, then turned to follow me out. I stepped out and looked up at the stars, enjoying the sharp, icy air as it cooled me down. I was serious, she said, her voice louder than normal. Welcome to sudden quiet after a room full of noise. I really am sorry about that comment yesterday. Me too, I said. I was way out of line. I had it coming. I didn't say anything, just tried to cool down. The lull in conversation seemed to make her nervous. You're really good. Seem to know a ton of songs and all. Used to play in a band back when I was still in school. Why'd you quit? Marriage and a career kinda got in the way. They'll do that to you sometimes, I guess. We were both silent for a few moments, and I turned to sneak a peek at her. She was looking up at the stars, her face lost in thought. I was right, wasn't I? I asked. She turned and looked at me. She gave me a hard look, her lips pressed with hesitation, then nodded. I'm divorced and it was pretty much all my fault. How so? The short answer or the long one? I looked at my watch. Whatever you feel like telling in the next 9 minutes. She sighed, then turned back to the inky sky with its millions of pinpricks of light. The short answer is I cheated on him. The long answer? We never should have gotten married. Why not? Because I'm not sure I ever really loved him. That was like a slap to the face. I felt my arms start to goosebump in the cold, and a deep shiver ran from head to toes. I loved him, of course, but it was more respect and admiration. He is a good man, a great man, solid, dependable, smart, good-looking. He was everything a husband should be, but there was never any spark. Then why did you marry him? At the time, it seemed like the thing to do. I was mid-20s. Marriage seemed the thing to do. But why him? He was comfortable, easy to get along with, and it never blossomed into anything more? She turned and gave me a look of unbearable anguish. It got worse. For me, at least. We had a little boy. She gave a bleak smile at the of him. That kept me focused for a long time. Then my career, too. Between those, they kept me pretty busy. And it just reached a point where I dreaded going home. It wasn't Luke, it was me. Other than a son, we really had nothing in common. We didn't want the same things. No shared hobbies, interests, nothing. Except your son. Except Kyle, she agreed. You ever tell him this? She shook her head. It's better that he thinks I was just cheating, that another man came between us. That's bullshit. Her face took on a determined edge. If I told him the truth, told Luke I'd been miserable almost since the get-go, before we got married even, he'd lose all those memories. What? Think about it, Mark. You look back on your marriage, you have happy memories, right? Memories where you were both in love and had fun, and it was all roses and sunshine, right? I didn't say anything. Truth be told, I was seeing it all differently now. Sandy's motives and emotions were now all jumbled and murky. As it stands, Sandy continued, her eyes again on the stars, Luke has memories of 10 years of happiness while we dated and were married, and only the last 5 or 6 months of pain and misery. I don't want to take that away from him. It's the one thing I can do. I don't need to shit all over his perceptions. And he doesn't suspect? Occam's razor. He took the easiest, most direct explanation. I pondered this, figuring she was right, at least insofar as she and Luke were concerned. The problem for me was that I was already questioning every memory I'd previously cherished. It was like someone had flipped the lens of the kaleidoscope, and now the daisies were dandelions. I didn't know what the real picture was. Time for you to get back, she said, bringing me back to the present. I looked at my watch. Yeah, I said, then leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. Sorry again. She tried her best to smile, then turned back to the stars as I went inside. Teddy Cooper stopped me on my way back to the stage. You're doing real good up there, man. Thanks, I said, pleased with myself. You got anything original? Like something I wrote myself? Yeah. I shrugged. Sure. Why don't you play a couple? I looked from him, then back to the crowd already clearing the dance floor. I'm not sure they'll want to. Just 1 or 2. Don't announce them as your own. They'll never know. Unless they really suck, I said. He laughed. Yeah, there could be that. I shrugged. I'll see what I can do. Once I was back on stage and plugged in again, I looked over the crowd and saw Whitney come back in and look around for her drink. Rebecca handed it to her, and they both turned to look toward the stage. Keeping my eyes on Whitney, I picked up the Taylor acoustic, popped a capo on the 2nd fret, and leaned into the microphone. There's a couple of really pretty ladies over there toward the bar with no guys around him bugging him for a dance. I'm gonna play a little belly bumper here in about 10 seconds, and I'm hoping someone will ask Am to the dance floor before I get started. I saw Rebecca laugh and take the first arm thrust her way. Whitney, on the other hand, seemed to shrink. Then a slim man in his early 40s stepped toward her and extended his arm and, with only a slight hesitation, she took his hand and followed. I plucked the strings with my fingers, and most everyone recognized the song right off. Her head on the man's shoulder. I could see her lips moving along by the time I reached the chorus. Winter, spring, summer, or fall now, all you've got to do is call. And I'll be there. Yes, I will, you've got a friend. That was just friggin' outstanding, son. Ferlin was gushing as he stood behind the bar counting the receipts and putting stacks of cash into a small bank bag. You packed him in and kept him here. Just amazing. I was sipping a beer, my first of the night, while Marla and Denise swept and mopped and dragged a huge garbage can around to collect the empty bottles and cans strewn throughout the place. I took another chug and gave a weary smile. It felt good. I hadn't done this in a long time, and now I realized that I missed it. A lot. The playing, the crowd, the energy. Even just playing for bar crowds was fun if you could get in their groove and play what they wanted to hear and get them all happy and forgetting about their worries for a while. I'd done that tonight. I hadn't wanted to stop, and Ferlin finally had to come on stage at 20 to 2 to announce one final song. Then everyone had to start clearing out before the cops got there and shut him down. You hear me? He said, suddenly standing directly across from me. Sorry, I said, turning to face him. I said, how much you want for playing tonight? I shook my head. Nothing. Don't work that way, he replied, his voice going low and getting serious. You made me a lot of money. Got me out of a jam, too. You hadn't been here. This place would have been dead. I shrugged. No biggie. Don't worry about it. He slid $400 bills across the bar toward me. That's a little less than I'd have paid Golden Rodeo, but they're a whole band. I looked at the money, then back to him. I don't want it, Ferlin. You're taking it. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. Take the goddamned money, Denise called out. He ain't leaving till you do, and we need to get home. I looked back and forth between Denise and Ferlin, a broad smile splitting my face. Shut up, Ferlin said. So the two of you? I asked. Used to be married, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Trying to get back together? I asked, keeping my voice down. I can hear you too, she snapped. And no, we're not trying to get back together. Just need to get laid is all. The both of us. I laughed. What's so goddamn funny? Ferlin said. Nothing. I just think it's... I don't know. What? Really, Ferlin? I don't know. Just strange, I guess. Why? He was serious. He didn't think anything was even remotely strange about going home with his ex-wife to knock off a piece. You really don't see it? No, I don't. I chuckled, then reached toward the money. Tell you what, I'll take this much. You keep the rest, but you're responsible for getting that equipment back to Teddy in the morning, okay? I left 2 of the bills sitting there, and Ferlin looked at them for a moment before shrugging and stuffing them into his pocket. Fair enough. Which reminds me, Teddy wants you to call him tomorrow. What for? Didn't say. You got his number? In the book, under Jenny's name, Jenny Cooper. I finished my beer. Okay then, I said. I stood, picked up my Taylor acoustic in its hard shell case, and went home to collapse. I was up and at M by 10:30. First order of business? Call Teddy Cooper, of course. A kid answered the phone, but Teddy was on in short order. Hey, Mark, he said. Mornin'. Ferlin said to call you? Those 2 you played last night. Your own. You spotted them? He laughed. Of course. That obvious, kind of. Okay, I said, my voice slowing down. What about them? How many more you got? Couple dozen. Think maybe I could see him? You're kidding me, right? No. Me and Nick both. I think he'll want to see him, too. Why? He paused, then said, they're not totally finished. The 2 you played, anyways. Need a bit of polishing up. Still, I think there's something there. I was both proud and disappointed. Hell, I thought they were done for ages. Then again, I'd never really thought they were all that good either. Thing is, Teddy continued, I think maybe me or Nick or both of us could help you get him finished. I was almost breathless with surprise. Teddy Cooper and maybe Nick Harlan were going to help me finish writing my songs? Then sing them? You there? I'm here, I said. So you're thinking of maybe recording them? Doubt it. Not really up our alley. But we know some people that probably would like to record them. And we've got an agent who'll want to meet with you and probably represent you and all that fancy stuff, too. So what's in it for you? Royalties, he said, surprised I'd asked. We help, we get a share. I pondered this. Only fair, I guess. It won't be 50-50 or nothing, he continued. You've already done most of the work. So how would it work? Not a clue. I guess we'll just figure it out as we go along. Percentages on each song depending on how much polishing I do, or Nick does, or whatever. I thought about his proposal for all of about a split second. I either turn him down and they never get published or accept and maybe make a mint. When? What? When do you want to meet? I said. I'll get a hold of Nick, then get back in touch with you sometime this week, okay? Sounds great to me. I stared at the telephone for 5 minutes after hanging up. The possibilities were endless. I could change careers, maybe get my own shot at the big time. I could see the throng swaying as I packed stadiums full of people there to see Mark Roberts. Then the mood passed, and I grabbed my keys to go grocery shopping before heading to the football game. I was standing at the deli counter waiting for my potato salad, coleslaw, and cheeses to get wrapped, weighed, and tagged. Figured you for a churchgoer, she said behind me. I turned and looked at Rebecca Galarza. Ma'am, I nodded, giving her a lazy smile before turning back and scooping up my meal fixins. Before I could wheel away, Rebecca bumped her card into mine. You were real good last night, she said, flashing a bright smile. Really good. Thanks. Is that what you did down there in Memphis? When you weren't busy freeing the innocent and generally just being a brilliant young attorney, you found time to be a famous country singer, too? No, I haven't done it in years. Playing in front of a crowd, at least. And that's why you've run away up here to Grant City. Because we're some kind of mecca of bar bands, and you're trying to break away from the law and hit it big in music? Her eyes in easy, teasing tone told me she was having fun with this. It was infectious, too. I felt myself smiling at her playfulness while looking over her casual faded jeans and t-shirt attire. You sizing me up, Mr. Southern Gentleman? I chuckled. Sorry, but you could make burlap look fetching. Fetching? Absolutely. You're smooth. I try. You succeed, she said, raising an eyebrow and giving me the once-over. When you bother trying, you got any plans for today? I hesitated, then said, sorry, but I'm afraid I've got someplace to go. Disappointment flickered across her face, replaced by false cheer. Maybe some other time? I wasn't sure what to do. She dropped by maybe a half dozen times in the time I'd been working at the hitching rail, each time having only 2 drinks gin and tonic with a lime every time before leaving. I'd only briefly talked to her once, but I'd seen her around the other men too. Though pretty, she'd not been mean or arrogant or any of the other things common to pretty girls who know they're pretty. Instead, she'd been mostly good-humored and lightly teasing. She smiled easily, rarely frowned, wasn't overly melodramatic, and seemed comfortable in her own skin. "Listen," I said, putting my hand on her shopping cart to stop her. "I've really got to go see someone today. It's important. To me." "Fair enough." She smiled, relaxing, that flirtatious smile back again. I looked at the contents of my shopping cart, then back to her. "Still," I started, then stopped, trying to figure out the right way to say it. "What I'm doing today won't really take all that long. Then I've just got to get my meals made for the week, which should only take a few hours." "You asking me out on a date?" she teased. I tensed and she said, "Because if you are, the answer's yes. You just tell me the time and the place and I'll be there. I don't really know where to go around here. I don't really feel like going to the rail on my day off, and my place isn't really set up for visitors. Still getting settled in? Came furnished. Just not the greatest, I guess. So it's really like a genuine bachelor pad? Like from college?" "Yep. I haven't seen one of those in ages," she said, rubbing her hands together. "Please, let me invite myself over for dinner?" My hesitation evaporated at her glee. Her energy was infectious, like it was an adventure. "I'll make us dinner," I said. "And I'll bring the drink," she countered. "Wine, beer, or booze? Your choice. I don't really drink much." "Fair enough." She looked into my shopping cart. "And what's for dinner?" "Sandwiches," I said. "I really like sandwiches." "Sandwiches," she said, nodding. Then her face brightened again, and she said, "Sounds perfect. Give me your address, and I'll be there." I did. Then, with a bright smile and a sachet of her perfectly pouty posterior, she was gone, whistling to herself as she did her own shopping. Dear listeners, we will be releasing the second part of this story in a few minutes. Please share your thoughts about the story in the comments section below.